Our
Have
neighborhood was
fun! Be
supposed to be
safe!
safe. Kids
Wow, it was
rode
fun!
bikes,
Love
neighbors
you!
waved at each other. Everything felt normal. But one day, black poles appeared along the streets. No signs.
No warnings.
Then the fines started. Not just for me, for everyone. The HOA claimed it was for safety, but we quickly realized safety wasn't the problem. This is the story of how our quiet neighborhood became a place of fear and how we finally fought back. The neighborhood was a picture of serenity. Not the sterile, empty kind of calm, but the kind of peace that made every visitor feel at ease. Birds perched on the branches of old oak trees lining the sidewalks, and the occasional dog barked in the distance, adding to the symphony of daily life rather than disturbing it. Lawns were trimmed neatly, hedges shaped perfectly, and porches glowed with warm light as evening fell. At the center of this calm lived Evan Carter. He wasn't particularly bold or outspoken. He didn't try to lead anyone or make waves. But he noticed things. Little things others overlooked. The way the streetlight flickered near the corner. The way the mail carrier always seemed rushed on Thursday mornings. The way neighbors smiled when greeting each other but never stayed too long outside. Life had always been predictable here. Children played after school in the cul-de-sac, their laughter echoing off the quiet homes. Elderly couples walked slowly down the winding street, leaning on each other, chatting softly. Cars moved at a gentle pace, as if everyone instinctively respected the neighborhood's rhythm. Then the emails started coming from the HOA. At first, they were harmless, friendly reminders. Please trim your hedges, or community pool closes at 8 p.m. But over time, the tone changed. The emails became shorter, colder, and more formal. Modern safety solutions are being implemented, one read. Data-driven enforcement will begin shortly, another said. Evan frowned. The words were vague. Nothing about community input or meetings. Nothing about what exactly was being enforced. The first day he saw the poles, they appeared like silent sentinels. A slim black rod planted neatly at the curb, almost unnoticeable unless you looked carefully. No signs. No warning. The HOA hadn't explained anything. By the end of the week, 3 more had been installed. One near the corner where kids often rode bikes, another near the downhill slope where cars naturally picked up speed, and the third directly in front of his neighbor Mrs. Henderson's house. Then the fines started arriving. Evan was shocked when he opened his mailbox to find a crisp envelope, addressed formally, listing a speed violation he hadn't committed. Others received them too. His neighbors whispered quietly, comparing numbers and dates, confused and anxious. This must be a mistake, one neighbor said. I didn't even pass that spot today, another replied. That night, the neighborhood felt different. The usual warm glow seemed dimmer. Porch lights flickered in the darkness, shadows stretching longer than usual. The peace was still there on the surface, but beneath it, a sense of being watched had settled. Evan couldn't shake the feeling. He walked slowly down the street, eyes tracing the tops of the poles. They didn't look dangerous. They didn't scream menace. But they observed, silently recording every motion. As he returned home, the weight of that silent gaze pressed on him. A sense of discomfort, subtle but constant, settled in his chest. This wasn't just about speed cameras. Something had changed. And he had a feeling that once something like this entered the neighborhood, life would never feel the same again. Confusion came first. Evan Carter, like most of his neighbors, didn't feel anger immediately. Instead, there was an odd, creeping uncertainty. A sensation that something unseen had entered the familiar calm of the street. It began with casual conversations. Across hedges and open windows, neighbors whispered quietly. Did you get the notice? One asked. Yes, another replied, a tone of disbelief in their voice. But I wasn't even driving near that spot that morning. It wasn't long before Evan realized this wasn't a one-off mistake. The fines were not random. They were relentless. Delivery drivers, visitors, even residents moving at perfectly reasonable speeds were being targeted. The HOA insisted these measures were for safety, citing data-driven enforcement. But no data was ever shown. No explanations were given. The cameras, when examined carefully, seemed oddly placed. They weren't near crosswalks, where children walked home from school. They weren't near the small playground tucked behind the community center. Instead, they were set along long stretches of road, downhill curves, spots where cars naturally accelerated. Evan noticed the change in his own behavior. He drove more cautiously than ever, hands gripping the steering wheel, eyes darting toward the poles that had become silent sentinels. He started leaving the house later, returning earlier, trying to avoid being recorded. Even when nothing illegal happened, a constant sense of surveillance hung in the air. And the HOA meetings, the meetings, they had grown tense. Residents would ask questions politely, their voices calm, only to be met with vague answers, half-statements, or shifting topics. It became clear that transparency wasn't just absent, it wasn't even considered. Families grew quieter. Children stopped playing outside in the same carefree way. The laughter that had once echoed through the cul-de-sac was muted, replaced by hushed tones and nervous glances. Parents drove slower, not out of safety, but fear of being fined. Neighbors avoided eye contact during morning walks. Everyone carried a subtle tension, like the quiet hum of a wire about to snap. Evan's anxiety grew, but curiosity overcame it. He began documenting everything. He wrote down times, vehicle descriptions, patterns of enforcement. The more he observed, the more it became clear. This wasn't about speeding. It wasn't about traffic safety. It was about control. The first incident that made him feel truly violated involved Mrs. Henderson, the elderly widow who lived 2 houses down. One afternoon, she stepped out to retrieve her mail, her small sedan parked legally by the curb. The camera flashed. She had no idea what she had done wrong. That night, a fine arrived. Tears welled up in her eyes as she read it. She had never had a parking ticket in her life. She had never imagined living in a neighborhood where even her most innocent actions were monitored and judged. Evan comforted her as best he could, but inside, he felt the weight of helplessness. The neighborhood was being watched without consent, and no one seemed able to stop it. By now, the streets had changed. Conversations happened behind closed doors. People avoided the cameras, but even when they weren't near them, a sense of anxiety lingered. It wasn't just surveillance. It was the implication that freedom, the simple act of walking, driving, or living without constant oversight, could be taken away at any moment. Evan began imagining the cameras themselves. He pictured their lenses as unblinking eyes, recording every motion, every detail, every moment. He felt a deep, unspoken anger, not toward the HOA entirely, but toward the idea that a neighborhood could be transformed overnight into a place of fear. When he received his own second fine, this time for a speed that was physically impossible in his car, a shiver ran down his spine. The certainty of violation, of oversight, had hardened into something more profound. The neighborhood had changed. And the people living in it hadn't realized how quickly quiet acceptance could be replaced by constant monitoring. That night, Evan sat on his porch, staring at the darkened poles, the unblinking watchers that had become part of the landscape. The wind rustled the leaves above, the streetlights flickered softly, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. The calm that had defined the neighborhood for decades was gone. And Evan knew one thing for certain. This wasn't about safety. It was about control. Evan Carter had reached a point where watching silently was no longer enough. He wanted to understand, to know why his peaceful neighborhood had been transformed into a place of fear. He began digging through old HOA documents, bylaws, and archived emails. He reread every community newsletter, every meeting note, every policy update. Slowly, patterns emerged. The cameras had been approved, technically, but without a proper community vote. The contract with the private company that ran the cameras had been buried in pages of dense legal language, shared only with board members. And hidden deep in the fine print was a clause most residents would never notice. The HOA earned a percentage of every fine issued. It wasn't just about safety. It was about profit. Evan's heart sank. The cameras, the fines, the meetings, everything was part of a system designed to benefit a few while quietly oppressing the many. When he brought his findings to a neighborhood meeting, he expected questions, maybe even support. What he got instead was tension. Board members smiled politely but spoke in circles, refusing to answer directly. Questions were labeled disruptive. Residents who spoke up too often received warnings, gentle at first, then more insistent, cautioning them against creating unrest in the community. Some neighbors defended the HOA, not because they agreed with the actions, but because fear had taken root. No one wanted to be the next target, the next person fined for a perfectly legal action. The cameras had instilled a quiet obedience. Then, something unexpected happened. During a monthly meeting, an elderly woman, Mrs. Henderson, the widow Evan had comforted before, stood up. Her hands trembled, her voice wavering. "I've lived here for 30 years, she said. "I've never felt afraid in my own home until now. I don't care about the fines. I care about feeling watched constantly." A hush fell over the room. Board members glanced at one another, unsure how to respond. The room, once polite but controlled, suddenly felt heavy with emotion. Evan realized that the cameras were more than devices. They were symbols of a neighborhood's trust being slowly eroded, of small freedoms quietly stripped away. By the end of the meeting, it was clear. The HOA couldn't explain itself. Facts, not accusations, had spoken louder than intimidation. And for the first time, Evan and the neighbors felt a spark of possibility. The fight wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it had begun. For the first time since the cameras appeared, the balance of power had shifted, not through anger, but through awareness. And Evan knew that if the neighborhood was to survive, they would have to stay united, calm, and patient. Because the HOA wouldn't listen until the residents had proof they couldn't ignore. The neighborhood was quiet, but the quiet had changed. It was no longer a peaceful calm. It was the tense silence of people holding back what they knew, waiting for something to happen. Evan Carter had started speaking with neighbors quietly in their living rooms. Not meetings, not confrontations, just conversations. Stories emerged, families stressed over unexpected fines, parents who had begun to fear driving, even small children who had stopped playing outside because the street no longer felt safe. The more Evan listened, the more he realized that the problem wasn't the cameras themselves, it was the power imbalance that had taken hold. They decided to act, not with anger or shouting, but with calm organization. Papers were collected, logs were kept, timelines were drawn. Every fine, every camera location, every unclear HOA communication was documented meticulously. The neighbors were careful, precise.
They didn't want to be dismissed.
They didn't want to give the board a reason to tighten control further. When the HOA called a public meeting, the room was filled. Not with chaos, but with quiet determination. Parents sat beside retirees. Longtime residents and newcomers alike were united by one truth. The cameras had changed their lives, and it was time the board answered to them. The meeting began. Evan, holding a stack of evidence, stepped forward first. One by one, residents presented their experiences. An elderly man spoke about his stress over fines that seemed impossible. A young mother talked about the anxiety she felt every time she drove her children to school. The room was filled with voices that had been silent for months, voices that now carried weight. The HOA board tried to deflect. Polite smiles, vague reassurances, technical jargon. But this time, the facts were undeniable. Documents were laid out. Timelines showed when approvals had been bypassed. Financial agreements revealed a hidden profit structure. The room was quiet except for the soft shuffling of papers. For the first time, the board didn't have answers ready. When the meeting ended, an outside authority was already being contacted to review records and assess the legality of the cameras and fines. The neighborhood felt a collective relief, but it was cautious.
No celebration.
Just a sense of quiet empowerment. For weeks after, the street began to breathe again. Children cautiously returned to the sidewalks. Parents no longer flinched at each curve. Residents exchanged smiles, tentative at first, but growing warmer with each passing day. Evan walked down the street one evening, watching neighbors talk freely on their porches. The poles still stood, but their power had diminished. They were no longer unchallenged. The neighborhood had discovered its voice. The cameras had been a silent threat, but in teaching the residents to speak up calmly, carefully, and collectively, they had also reminded everyone of something more important. True community wasn't about rules enforced from above. It was about trust, respect, and being heard. And for the first time in months, the street felt like home again. The tension that had gripped the neighborhood for months finally began to ease, but slowly, quietly, almost imperceptibly. The cameras still stood along the street, silent sentinels that had once instilled fear, but now their menace had lost its power. The real change had come not from the machines, but from the people who had refused to stay silent. Fines were reviewed. Some were refunded. Others were disputed successfully, their legitimacy questioned and overturned. The HOA leadership underwent changes. Board members who had been complacent or too focused on enforcement were replaced with residents who valued transparency and community trust over profit. Policies were rewritten. Any future enforcement required proper voting, community notice, and complete clarity. The neighborhood had reclaimed its voice. Evan Carter walked down the familiar sidewalks one evening, the sun low on the horizon, casting long, gentle shadows. Children played again in the cul-de-sac. Parents watched them without fear. The elderly waved to neighbors as they strolled. The street smelled of freshly cut grass, the aroma mingling with the soft rustle of leaves. The ordinary peace that had once defined the neighborhood was returning, but it felt deeper now, earned rather than assumed. Evan paused near the corner where the first camera had been installed. He traced his fingers along the post. The metal felt cold and impersonal. For months, it had been a symbol of control and oversight, of trust broken in small, precise increments. But now it was just a post. A reminder that even in the most orderly places, balance could be disrupted and restored. The lessons were subtle but profound. Safety had never been the problem. The problem had been silence. The quiet acceptance of rules imposed without explanation, without consent. The lesson of the cameras, of the fines, and of the tense months in between was simple. A community was only as strong as the voices within it. That night, Evan returned to his porch. The streetlights flickered gently as the neighborhood settled into its familiar rhythms. He watched a group of children laugh as they raced down the sidewalk, a small dog chasing after them. Neighbors waved across lawns, their greetings unhurried, warm, and genuine. For the first time in a long while, there was no tension in the air. Evan thought about the months of fear, confusion, and quiet rebellion. He thought about Mrs. Henderson, whose voice had reminded everyone that courage didn't always roar. It often spoke softly, unwaveringly, from a place of truth. He thought about the neighbors who had once avoided eye contact but now smiled openly. And he understood something essential. Rules could be challenged, power could be questioned, and injustice, even if subtle, could be corrected when a community stood together. The street felt alive again. Peace wasn't simply restored, it had been reclaimed. And as Evan looked across the familiar scene, he realized one truth that would stay with him forever. Safety was never the problem. Silence was.